Let's now focus on how postmodernism differs from modernism, because without understanding modernism, we cannot really truly appreciate what postmodernism is really about. Francis Schaeffer, arguably the most influential Christian philosopher in the latter 20th century. Now, note when he died. He died in 1984. He was very concerned about what was happening to Western world in general, and American society in particular, and he was seeing a great conflict between evangelical Christians, Bible-believing Christians, versus secular humanists. That's the term they often use, or secular liberals. Now, I'm going to talk about that man, Arthur Schlesinger, because he represents secular humanists and secular liberals against whom Schaeffer dedicated his life to save us from, for he thought that their humanism was going to destroy Western civilization. That was 1984. But I began to see in the early 1990s that which Schaeffer didn't see coming. Nobody saw this coming in the 1980s. But in the 1990s, I began to see something, and I got really interested. This is my dissertation at Fuller. The title of my dissertation was The Prophetic Witness of Public Theology in Postmodern Cultural Wars. In the 90s, there were so many books published that followed the paradigm of cultural wars. It was all about cultural war between the cultural left, cultural left of the 30 years ago would be conservative today, by the way. But what was left then and the right were fighting, and yet we began to see some strange phenomena that Schaeffer never saw coming. So alarming was the development that the two arch enemies began to sing the same tune. The conservative, the secular liberals and humanists, they were coming together and they were singing the same tune because they were both worried. Peggy Noonan was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. She's still around. I think she's columnist for Wall Street Journal. And she said this in one of her books in 1995. Liberals or conservative, Democrat or Republican, the smartest people in America are now deeply concerned about the ability of our country to continue well in the next century as a stable and happy democracy. So something was happening. The landscape of American moral life was so alarming that they were actually saying the same thing. Right now, I'm going to present two seemingly disparate issues, but I actually join at the hip to show how Noonan's concern then pales in comparison to what is actually taking place in the 21st century America. Nobody saw this coming. Even the most secular liberal of the liberals in the 80s and 90s never saw what was coming. We're here truly in an uncharted territory. Two issues that are very familiar to us. They seem very dissimilar, and yet they are joined at the hip. Let me go back to Arthur Schlesinger. 1992, he wrote a book called The Disuniting of America, Reflection on Multicultural Society. He wrote about multiculturalism. Now, in the 1990s, it was all about multiculturalism. They were already saying that Jefferson should be canceled. I don't remember ever hearing the word cancel, but people on the left were already having problem with Jefferson because he was slaveholder. It was not a 21st century thing. It was already brought up in 1990s. They were already talking about canceling Columbus Day, which they succeeded. And also, they were already segregating dormitories based on ethnicity. So African-American students had their own dormitory. Now, Arthur Schlesinger, he's a friend of African-American, Black American coalition, and yet this flaming liberal wrote this book, and this is his conclusion: the result of multiculturalism can only be fragmentation, resegregation, and tribalization of American life. He was very alarmed at what was going on in the early 90s. At the time, conservative book club that made available books written by such conservative as Rush Limbaugh, they offered Schlesinger the book and said this: we never dreamed it would happen. To be sure, the old liberal hasn't quite repented, but isn't this a step in the right direction? They couldn't believe that secular liberal like Arthur Schlesinger was saying things that conservatives were already saying, because liberals saw something in the air and they were very alarmed. At this very time, I don't remember really hearing the word critical race theory in those days. But the definition of critical race theory was there, but it was known as multiculturalism. Leonard Jeffries, still around, at the time he was chairman of Black Studies at New York City University, he would be the traditional ally of white secular liberals, but he called this man, who was a friend of Jack Kennedy, a weakling, slick, and devilish part of very nice white folks who distort history in racial pathology. The fact that this chairman of Black Studies called Arthur Schlesinger these names, it was so telling, because he's not a conservative, he's not evangelical, he's a flaming liberal. But they broke on this matter. Look, Schlesinger had no idea where multiculturalism was headed. No one did. Now, multiculturalism sounds pretty innocent. Several cultures, maybe different food, different clothes. Well, there's another name for multiculturalism, and this also may not sound all that ominous. It's called tribalization. Before I explain to you how tribalization of 1990s looks like in 2021, I want to give you a quick review of the development of pluralism. First, you have to start with ethnic pluralism. And that which fuels ethnic pluralism is immigration. From 1830 to 1930, there were 35 million Europeans who came to this country as legal immigrants. Without ethnic pluralism, you don't have what we have today. You got to have people from different cultures in the same place. Next, you have a cultural pluralism. Washington Day, Black History Month, Cinco de Mayo, which Mexicans do not really celebrate that much. It's no big deal, really. Independence Day, yeah. And Asian American Heritage Month. So cultural pluralism, hey, we are all in agreement. Yeah, we should recognize that. So far, so good. No problem, right? And then we go to religious pluralism. Luther, Pope, rabbis, Muslims. Oh, my, it gets tricky right now, right? And then that is one step away from moral pluralism. Your absolutes are not my absolutes. Philosophical pluralism, your truth is not my truth. Epistemological pluralism, your fact is not my fact. Without ethnic pluralism, cultural pluralism, religious pluralism, you don't have moral, philosophical, epistemological pluralism. They actually go under one unifying term, and that term is tribalization. It's pre-modern, but I thought we were talking about postmodern. Pre-modern is postmodern. There's no difference. Postmodern is where tribal warfare has resumed, that stopped for a while during modernity. And you know what is going to fuel moral pluralism, philosophical pluralism, and epistemological pluralism? It's going to be immigration again. Now, they say that Democrats don't mind open border because they get Democratic voters. That could be, but I'm not talking about politics. More people from outside come in, which is a neutral point for me. It's just a legality matter. That's for another time. If it's morally relative now, it'll be more so in the future. If it is epistemologically relative today, it will be more so in the future as ethnic plurality becomes even more graphic. Now, there's one governing principle that dictates moral, philosophical, and epistemological pluralism. That's what I want to talk about today. That's what we have to know. What is a governing principle that affects three pluralism that I just talked about? That was 1992 when Arthur Schlesinger wrote his book. He was very worried that Jefferson was being canceled and the black students have their own dormitory, resegregation all over again. He was worried about cultural pluralism running amok. He wasn't really concerned about moral pluralism. He's a secular humanist. He wasn't quite worried about that. He was just worried about America being divided. But in 2021, Tribalization of America looks very different. For instance, this past year, while looting and rioting were taking place in several major cities, it wasn't uncommon to hear this from the aggrieved black community. One black person wrote, "Stop using the term riot to describe the current actions. These are rebellions." Another black individual said, "American society tells white men that their opinions have merit and that their voice is valuable. Should they still be allowed to share their opinion? Hell no. If you aren't part of the press, you lack knowledge to weigh in." So who is you here? Basically, if you are not a member of the aggrieved black community, such as myself, an Asian, I'm told, be quiet. It's not your thing. You just stay out. We're going to decide what we're going to do. You see, that is a critical part of critical race theory. One of the components of critical race theory is people of color are uniquely qualified to speak on behalf of other members of their group regarding the forms and effects of racism. I could switch some words around. What this means is that people who are not black are uniquely unqualified to speak regarding the forms and effects of racism. So stay out. Now, if you're not sure what this is about, let me give you an example in which you will have no problem understanding what we're talking about. Let me take you to Peru. In a lot of tribes, wife beating is way of life. In the particular tribe, missionaries went down there and they were able to stop that practice. The husbands were no longer beating wives. Missionaries did that. Great work. There was an anthropologist from university who really did not like the fact that the men stopped beating their wives. No, not because he thought morally it was okay, but on cultural grounds. So he spoke to one of the Christians who were in this tribe and said this: "I would bet if you asked any one of those old women if they thought wives ought to be beaten, they would say yes. Is he moral relativist? Is he into wife beating? No, not on those principles, but on this. Any influence, redemptive or not, is not good. The tribes are better off left alone rather than corrupted by Western imperialism, and worse, the Bible." Now, is it clear to you what we're talking about? You see, unless you are part of my tribe, your truth doesn't count. That's the beginning of the governing principle of tribalization. Unless you are part of my tribe, your truth doesn't count. That's how it was pre-modern. We're back at it in postmodernity. Second, each tribe determines what is true. Third, truth is relative to culture. Third, culture, therefore, is sovereign. That is the governing principle of tribalization, the denial of the existence of universal truth on account of culture. Culture has won. Question: how do you respond to a worldview that places culture at the center? What is your understanding of culture? How do you respond to the adherents of CRT anti-racism that tells you to keep quiet while they discuss matters of racial justice? It sounds like they have a case. Well, we're the victims, so what right do you have to butt into our affairs? Keep out. And many of us, yes, will just be quiet. The same thing as that Western anthropologist telling Christians, do not butt into the affair. Culture is sovereign. Stay away. Now, with wife beating, we think, no, we have to get involved, right? Because there's a greater truth than what culture decides. How's it different from calling looting and rioting rebellion and justifying it? I said two issues, right? Two similarly disparate issues joined at the hip that reveal a key postmodern discourse, and that is cultural relativism culture is sovereign. So the second issue that I'm going to present is transgenderism. What does transgenderism have to do with culture? Everything. These days, the discourse is biological sex is a social construct. That's the discourse. In this world, the word not cannot be used with this. If you do, then you'll be canceled. They canceled J.K. Rowling. They canceled her. Quintessential secular liberal. But she stood up on this one. Biological sex is a social construct. That is not true. And she said, it isn't hate to speak the truth. And they canceled her. We don't stand a chance. So, culture is sovereign. Okay. But what does it have to do with transgenderism? How we got here. Biological sex is a social construct. The flaming liberals of 20th century never saw this coming. Who would have thought that we would be talking about this, right? However, there was a person who said something like that. Her name was Simone de Beauvoir. She was a friend of Sartre, French philosopher. She died in 1986, so not quite 21st century. And she said, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So on the face value, she was already saying that biological sex is a social construct. No, that's not what she meant. She didn't mean that biological sex is a social construct, because at that time, you couldn't think that. What she said was, no biologically based traits of women are beyond cultural control. So there are differences in traits, but whatever difference they may be, cultural control can overcome it. Women can do whatever man can do. You just have to change cultural environment. She never said man and woman are the same. She just said women can do what men can do in a structure of equity. Change the structure, then women can do whatever man can do. You see, modern feminism, women can do what men can do, but in postmodern feminism, women can be men and vice versa. It is fundamentally, substantially, absolutely different. You see, culture won. Biology lost. Culture is sovereign. Choose your own sex. My child will choose the desired sex later. You can shape culture, and in the 80s, you can do whatever you want. Now you can be the sex that you prefer. I was talking to Pastor Keith a while ago, and he said there are 3 courses that ruin the faith of freshmen. Biology 101, Psychology 101, and Philosophy 101. Absolutely, in modernism. But I tell you, the field that is above all those 3 is cultural anthropology. They won. They have displayed disproportionate power over all the other disciplines. You see, the postmodernism, human behavior shaped only by nurture and culture rather than nature, except for homosexuality. So they pick and choose. Not for homosexuality, that's all nature, but everything else is nurture and culture, but nature is dead. Again, first discourse of postmodernity is cultural relativism. Culture is sovereign. That's the first discourse. So we have to have a better understanding of culture and what cultural relativism is and how it affects our understanding of race and even transgenderism. And it must begin with the recognition that while culture is important and it must be factored in, nevertheless, it is not sovereign. God is sovereign, and His Word is sovereign, and God's Word will be the final arbiter of culture. That concludes the second session. Now take a moment to consider the 3 discussion questions. In the following session, we will address the second postmodern discourse. Thank you.